guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Jen. If you're new here, I am a chronically ill neurodivergent PhD student and disability activist, and I kind of talk about all of those things depending on what's happening in my life and what is presently kind of challenging me or coming up. So you're welcome here, and I hope you're having a good day. I am recording this and I'm not super sure how it's going to go or what I'm even properly going to say, but I guess I just wanted to have somewhere where I put my preliminary thoughts about this. For those of you who don't know, I am 30 years old. I turned 30 last week, which doesn't really feel like that big a deal. It kind of feels like I feel almost ageless, but then simultaneously, because of my health, have felt older for a long time. But it was still really nice. But I was diagnosed as autistic when I was 26. I actually received an ADHD diagnosis first and then an autism diagnosis, which I'm learning through trying to research ADHD or autism and ADHD experiences, that's actually, sorry, I got a hiccup. That's actually not like that common. A lot of the time it's autism and then ADHD happens, but for me they both happen in very quick succession, so I kind of see them as something that happened almost together because there was only about a 2-month gap in between. But in that time, I suppose come April 2025 I will be diagnosed 4 years, so in that time I can only describe my experience being diagnosed as autistic, knowing I'm autistic, as positive, as being tremendously beneficial for me. But so many people, I guess, in my work, I work in disability services and have done for a good few years at this point, and also people in my life, different people have asked me at different points and said either maybe they were considering that they might be autistic, somebody in their life, is considering, and they've kind of said, is it worth going for an assessment? Or would you recommend it? Or, yeah, I think I might be autistic, but the assessment is so expensive. I don't know also what I would even learn, because is self-identification not the same thing? All of that kind of thing, and kind of asked my opinion on it. And it's been happening more and more recently, just by merit of who I'm meeting in my life and things, which is totally fair. And I will say from the off, I think self-identification is entirely valid when it comes to autism, when it comes to a lot of neurodiverse experiences. I think it's completely valid. I don't think it's for me to say whether something is valid or invalid, even, to be honest. Yeah, I don't really think it should be for me to bloody comment. But if someone tells me they're autistic, and for me, it never occurs to me to ask whether they have a formal diagnosis or not. That kind of feels irrelevant, because I think if you have taken the time to have this sit with you and to think, could I possibly be autistic? I'm going to trust whatever internal process happened for you, and I think I wish people would meet other people in good faith with that. That being said, I'm someone who personally benefited from the actual assessment experience and like what that experience gave me and the processing room it gave me, all of those kind of things. So when I'm answering these people who say, should I go for an assessment, is it worth it if I know I'm autistic, I'm always trying to tell them, and it's the same thing I'll say here, I'm answering from my experience, my personal experience, which is as a, like, I suppose, like, as an autistic woman who was diagnosed at 26, who's lived my very particular life. I can't really give very specifics, but I can tell you what I believe to have been true about how the assessment process impacted me and how I've seen it impact others. Like for me, for example, when I tell people, I've worked in, like I said, in disability services, particularly with autism for almost 4 years, almost since my diagnosis. So I've met a lot of autistic adults in that time, people who've been diagnosed, since childhood, or people who've been diagnosed, like I've met women in particular who've been diagnosed into their 80s. They're some of the most incredible people I've met and had the privilege of working with. Before that, there's different kind of reactions to people when they ask me at what age I was diagnosed, which is, a relatively common conversation when you meet another autistic person, I think. And if you're talking about autism, if you meet another autistic person, it's not a guarantee that you're automatically going to talk about autism. You know, that's not just because we have this one thing in common in terms of a diagnosis doesn't mean that we're automatically aligned as people. However, one of the common reactions I do get is people saying, you know, oh, 26 is so young to be diagnosed. 26 was so young. And it certainly was, but it always helps me learn, I guess, the angle at which someone is viewing life. And I suppose, you know, if I'm talking to someone who's diagnosed in their 50s, 26 is exceptionally young. It's probably no different to how I look at people who tell me they're diagnosed when they were 4 and 5. And I think, oh, thank God, like, that experience was beneficial for you. Or, you know, if it wasn't, also acknowledging and hearing that. But when I think about it, like when people say 26 was so young, what does that mean? And this is where I answer the benefit of an assessment or not. Because for me, I think that each day spent without self-knowledge opens the door for a lack of self-acceptance. For me, not being diagnosed till I was 26 meant that I started play school and I charmed people in my class. Mom was always telling me that I kind of had the play school teachers like wrapped around my finger, all of this kind of thing. And I consciously remember being 5 and doing that and consciously knowing I needed to be likable. Because I felt this inherent difference. I remember probably from 4 feeling that. It meant that in primary school I was 10 and trying to pretend that I really liked the Pussycat Dolls, even though I felt objectively nothing towards music, you know, until I was potentially around 14, like 13, 14, where Taylor Swift came in. But it meant trying to connect on another frequency with people because I was renouncing the frequency I had in my own mind because I didn't understand it, because it wasn't acknowledged that I was actually playing a different instrument altogether compared to the orchestra that I was surrounded by, and that there was nothing wrong with that. Whereas instead it just felt like, actually I'm in this orchestra but I'm just squeaky, so if I just mirror everyone really, really well, eventually it'll click and I'll be in harmony. It also meant I remember when I was 16 and in transition year, which in Ireland is, you know, a year between after you take your kind of your junior cert, which is an exam, quite an intensive exam that you take at 15, before you go into the leaving cert cycle, which is the next step up, I guess. You can have a transition year that is a more relaxed year, less academically focused, more about like work experience, things like that. I remember my goal for transition year being to become more likable. And I was 16. I remember telling my best friend at the time this, and he looked at me and was like, but you are likable now. And I remember thinking, God, you just don't get it. I'm not likable how I should be. You like me because I'm quirky and a little bit odd. And I was like, whereas I wanted to like fit. Like, not knowing I was autistic meant I was in 19 and I was in freshers in college, and I would leave the dance floor after pretending I was having the time of my life and people were taking photos and it was great, and I go sit on the steps outside the nightclub and hold myself so tightly and pinch my skin to try and pull myself back into myself, and then just like shake it off and put back on the smile and go back in to see my friends. Like, not knowing I was autistic meant I did my first office job feeling such a degree of anxiety about the sensory experiences of the office, not realizing that was what was triggering my anxiety. So I would spend so much time in the bathroom rubbing the heel of my hand to my breastbone, which is something I still do when I find soothing, and trying to breathe and breathe and breathe, and then putting on that smile and being like, okay, well, I'm gonna even pick clothes that make me look like I fit rather than clothes that feel good to me in a sensory experience. So for me, the assessment process gave me the space and the time to sit with the intricate differences of my brain that I don't think I would have had time to sit with the exact nuances if I hadn't done the assessment process, if I had just self-identified, which is completely valid, but I know how I would have done the self-identification is I think I wouldn't have read about it enough, I wouldn't have absorbed enough about it, whereas having a detailed report that was quite affirming really, And going through that process meant I had to sit with each moment. The psychiatrist had to talk to my mother to talk about what I was like as a child. All of these things had to happen. And they were exceptionally beneficial, but because I have ADHD and I would have hyperactive tendencies in my brain, like in terms of how I think, I can be very like, my thoughts can be moving at 90 miles an hour. I think I wouldn't sit and give process time, whereas the assessment process slowed it down for me. It broke it down and said, okay, here's all of the different stages you have ever been, all the gens you've ever been. Let's look at them and see what was going on for you. I also think if I hadn't had the formal assessment, I would have probably had a degree of imposter syndrome. That being said, it was very expensive, and in Ireland there's no public system for adults to get diagnosed as autistic, so I want to acknowledge there's 1,000 inhibiting factors to a very expensive, difficult process, and I know it's also, there's 1,000 ways that it's difficult to access if you're even, if you're a person of colour, if you're a member of the travelling community, things like that. There's a lot of medical bias against different minorities in Ireland, I think, and I don't think that's particularly acknowledged, and it's not something I'm beyond knowledgeable about, but I think it's something that I have to be certainly aware of if I'm telling someone, oh, definitely get an assessment, that actually there's components and nuance here. But that's, I suppose, where I start the conversation about the assessment, is from that point of view of looking at all the gens I've been and all of the ways I haven't known myself, and that lack of self-knowledge has led to a lack of self-awareness. One thing I will say is I think there is I can see, and it's a pattern I've seen once again within my own very limited personal experience, there can be a resistance to exploring an autism assessment depending on the age of people I'm talking to. Like, for example, people in my family or friends, whatever, people I've worked with, I might disclose that I'm autistic and they'll say, I actually really think I'm autistic as well. But, I'm in my 50s or 60s, so I don't think there's no point in me going about it. Sure, what would I benefit from at this age? It's constantly people saying I'm too old. I don't need any supports. I've learned how to cope. Sure, what would that do for me, benefit-wise? And I always feel so deeply for those people. Like, in my head, emotionally, like I feel so deeply for them. In a way, because I feel like in the moment, it's like those people in front of me, their edges become a little bit hazy, and I can see, instead of seeing just this maybe 50-year-old man in front of me or this 70-year-old woman or whoever, I can see who they might have been when they were little and like excited by the world, or when they had what was considered over the top, oversensitive reactions to things growing up in the 40s in Ireland or in the 60s in Ireland or whatever, or who they were when they got their first job and tried to move to Dublin, or when they had their first marriage and first went through the difficulties of pregnancy and that sensory experience. Or I feel like I can see all of them, and it's for all of those versions of themselves that I want them to have had the assessment process. And not even even if it isn't a formal assessment process, but just I think I want each part of who they've ever been to be held a little bit and given the validation. So what I say to people is, if you are someone who is potentially dealing with like childhood trauma or things like that, which I think a lot of autistic adults are dealing with, for a myriad of reasons, but if you are, potentially consider whether the assessment process, or even exploring it in a preliminary conversation, even if it's a small conversation, or exploring accessing an autistic therapist, to see if talking to a professional who communicates similarly to you or something might be beneficial. Consider who you're doing that for. Are you doing that for you right now, or are you doing it for all of the yous that you've ever been, that never got acknowledged, that never got validated or held or seen, really? Because that's the one thing the assessment process has given me over the last 3 years, nearly 4 years, is time to, now when I see photos of myself when I'm little, and I used to have such a degree of tension about them because I would feel so angry with that version. I could see a picture of my 10-year-old self, and I'd remember on holidays, maybe when we went on a family weekend away, and I'd remember how I ruined it because I was really overwhelmed with the change, so therefore I became highly agitated by everything, so therefore I became dysregulated, so therefore I was mean to my sister, so therefore I ruined it. That was what I was looking at that photo with. And I would have looked at every photo of me ever for the rest of my life with that same lens of fault if I didn't have the understanding now to be able to give myself compassion and look at that 10-year-old in that photo and say, I think she's kind of great. And I think I love her. And I think she's gonna learn some things, and yeah, she's gonna hurt people. She's also gonna learn to apologize. She's gonna learn to acknowledge hurt honestly. And I think she might just make some big waves in her life. And I honor that. And I hope I look back on photos of me now, like when I'm in my 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, however old I manage to get. And I look back at me who's just turned 30 and I think, I like her. I like who she was. I like how she was trying so hard to be, just to be, actually, not even to be anything, just to be and survive and exist as herself without the assessment process, without someone saying, looking me in the eye and saying to me, you are not fault, you are not blame, and you are not shame. You are just person. And here's your brain. I don't think I would never stop existing without that self-hatred and without that tension. I'm getting really emotional, my God. I planned this video out in terms of planned being, I planned to sit down and talk about it, didn't plan it. But I think I forget how much empathy this has released in me. I used to pre-assessment do things where if I was watching a movie with my family and it was actively really like an emotional movie, I would shut down my feelings or my crying and things because it was like if I started being upset about one thing, God knows what else would come out, you know? So I just need to get a grip and become tougher and all of those things. Whereas now I'm like, my feelings are valid no matter when I feel them, even if it's inconvenient for other people. And I show that they're valid by validating others. And what I do for others, I need to be able to do for myself. But without the formal assessment process, without acknowledging that I had complex feelings around who I was, I could not reframe them. I truly couldn't. So if you are someone who's however old, and you think you might be autistic or have ADHD or be dyslexic or whatever it is, and you're just thinking, is it worth it? I probably only have a good 20 years left on the planet anyway, or haven't I survived this long, or I haven't fought this long through life, sucking up and putting up to whatever. Maybe think about who you might have been if you didn't have to fight your very self so hard. You won't be able to go back and turn back the clock and fix everything. But for the potential of knowing even a glimmer of who that is and how that feels to have that freedom in your head, you're worth that time and that knowledge, and you're worth the assessment process if that's what you choose to do, or you're worth diving into self-identification or whatever it is. Your journey is yours and it's absolutely valid. I think I'm just going to round this video up by saying, once again, my experience is so personal. Everyone's experience is so personal, really, of just life. But if I could give any advice that I think might be helpful, and once again, take what you want, leave what you want, unlike this video if you want, I will say, give yourself time post-assessment, if you do decide to go with the assessment, to feel as complex about it as you want. Like I felt a huge degree of devastation when I was diagnosed, and that wasn't, and this is the thing, is I'm even trying to untangle how I speak about it now. I that wasn't because I inherently hated autism or being autistic. It's because I felt angry for those 26 years. And then I felt shattered by learning that no matter how much I tried to trim the edges of myself, I wasn't fitting into this picture. So I felt angry for time lost. Now it's taken 4 years for me to realise, actually, I think I felt a good degree of devastation about being autistic. I think that's probably true. Whereas I think I felt like that was a betrayal to the autistic community to admit when I was first diagnosed, because I did feel overwhelming relief, but that I even had this hint where I thought maybe life would be easier if I wasn't autistic. That felt like a real betrayal and lying or something, but I don't actually think that's a betrayal at all. I think that's just allowing myself to feel how I felt post-diagnosis. So if you do go down the assessment and you find yourself feeling complex emotions towards autism, towards yourself, towards the people in your life who maybe didn't notice, feel it. Don't try to push it. Don't try to write it out faster than you can. Just feel it. You might need to take time away from people, like seeing people less during that time. It might take weeks, months, years, whatever it takes. Remember that you did this process probably because you knew you were worth time. You were worth time and knowledge. So you're worth time and knowledge now. The other thing I would say as well is to consider, I personally, obviously I talk about being autistic on the internet, so it's kind of out there. I also am openly autistic in my workplace and all of those things. But I do fully respect people who choose to disclose at different times or disclose in certain areas of their life, or who choose, I know a lot of people who get diagnosed later in life and then choose not to tell their parents, for example, or, you know, they have particular family members where they're not going to tell anyone. It can be really beneficial to give yourself time post-diagnosis before you tell anyone anything. Not because you are ashamed. And I think that can be difficult to try and rationalize. Is in my head, I felt like if I didn't tell people, that meant I was ashamed of who I was. And they needed to see this relief too. And they needed to see, actually, I'm still Jen, but I'm actually even more Jen. And all of these things. But actually, there's nothing wrong with giving yourself a pause. That doesn't mean you hate autism. That doesn't mean you hate yourself. That doesn't mean you're not going to live the most fruitful, colourful life. But it means you're just respecting the process and what that means for you. And that's completely fine. The other thing I would say is you will never be able to change how people think about autism. And I really wish someone had put like their hand on my shoulders when I was first diagnosed and said that, and said, there's only so much you can change, which means you will be meeting a stranger who might be interviewing for you for a job, or who might be whatever, and you are at prey to their idea of autism and their knowledge of autism, who they last met who's autistic, what story they last heard on the radio, things like that. You are vulnerable to that. That's not your responsibility to change a narrative. Your responsibility is to honour yourself. Whereas this is something I'm actively struggling with myself, and like I'm trying to be aware of, because like that, I'm only 4 years, not even like 3.5 years post-diagnosis, but I do find myself, if someone says like, oh God, I didn't think you'd be autistic, I immediately start masking and like trying to camouflage who I am and trying to be like the best representative of autism possible. That's not my responsibility. That's not any of our responsibility. It's the other person's responsibility to respect me as a human being as I am. If somebody doesn't, well, that's also not my responsibility. But it will hurt. You will hear people say things about autism, and they will say them around you if you are someone who is considered, that is like high masking and that is later diagnosed. They'll say these things. They'll be like, we obviously don't mean you. Your autism's different. You're not that kind of autistic, is what I hear. And it will hurt. And it will sucker punch, and it'll hurt because it'll come from people you love. But it's not your responsibility to change or educate anyone. You can have days where you feel like you're able to have the conversation where you could say, well, actually, I really don't like how you use that language, or actually, I don't think that's really nice, or whatever. It's okay if you have days, weeks, months, or just general relationships with people where you know, I'm actually not here to educate you on autism. Because your first responsibility is to your brain and to your well-being. and I wish someone had said that to me. So I'm going to end there. That's just my thoughts, kind of spitballing all of this. But thank you guys so much for watching and for putting up with the ramble of this and sitting with me on my bedroom, kitchen, studio, one room house floor. I really, really appreciate it. And I'll see you guys soon. And if you are thinking about doing an assessment, if you think whatever, I am with you, and make sure you are honouring yourself and all of the yous that have ever been, because they deserved to be held and honoured for all those decades or however long as well. Even if no one has said it, they did. Even if you weren't flawless, even if you were what people call difficult. That doesn't matter. You deserve to be heard and seen. So, yeah, sending you guys love, and take care. Bye.